Welcome to BibleDudes. This lecture is about Hosea, one of the minor prophets in the Hebrew Bible. In Hebrew, his name is Hosea, which means he has helped, he has saved, or he has delivered. It's likely a shortened form of a longer name that had a theophoric element, including the name of El or Yahweh, something like Hoshael or Hosea. Even Yehoshua, which in English is Joshua, uses the same root. Right, Joshua is, of course, Jesus' Hebrew name. All right, Hosea is commonly known as the prophet of love. Oh, yeah. And by the way, I'd advise you not to search on the internet for the term prophet of love. Hosea gets his nickname not because he's a ladies' man, but instead because at the heart of the book is a story about how God loves the people of Israel. Sure, God's angry, and he's going to destroy them for their sins of religious infidelity, but Hosea claims that God will eventually take them back and love them once again. So here's where we're at in the Hebrew Bible, or in the Tanakh, which again is an acronym for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. We're in the Nevi'im section. In the latter prophets, he's one of the minor prophets, not major, and we see him up here. He's the first one in the traditional order. All right, there are 4 prophets who have books named after them who prophesy during the 8th century BCE, or the second half of the 8th century BCE. And the other ones are Amos, Micah, and Isaiah. Well, Hosea is unique. He is the only prophet of Israel to have a prophetic book named after him. The rest of them are all from Judah, Israel's neighbor to the south. Hosea began making oracles before the death of Jeroboam II, who died after a long 40-year reign. He died around 750, 745 BCE, something like that. His oracles continued through a very turbulent period, with several kings being assassinated. And the thing was, the Assyrian Empire was getting stronger and stronger, until eventually the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed in 722 BCE. After 722, someone brought the oracles of Hosea down to south to Judah, where Judean scribes wrote them down, and they added some references to the Davidic monarchy who was ruling Judah. So Hosea is a contemporary of Amos, except Amos's career is much shorter. Hosea's career lasts much longer. All right, we're going to divide Hosea up into 2 parts. The first part is a story about Hosea's marriage. That's chapters 1 through 3. It also includes his 3 children that we'll get to in a second. Then chapters 4 through 13 are about Israel's crimes and the punishments that God's going to give to them. But it has a little bit of hope, because after the punishments, there's going to be future repentance and reconciliation. All right, let's turn now to the message of Hosea. Remember, these prophets are not writing for you. They were writing in their own worlds, trying to enact change in their own communities. For Hosea, the thing that seems to have upset him the most was worshiping deities other than Yahweh. Things were pretty good for wealthy Israelites under the reign of Jeroboam II. But when Jeroboam II died, things went downhill pretty rapidly. Hosea witnessed the social, moral, and religious decay of northern Israelite society. Then, as the Assyrians grew in power, politics became more tumultuous. There were 4 kings assassinated in a 14-year period. Then eventually the Assyrian army conquered the capital city of Israel, which was Samaria, the capital city, in 722 or 721 BCE. And the Israelites were taken into exile. That's where we get the 10 lost tribes. We're not really lost. We know they were just taken to an area that's now, I guess you'd call it Iran today, and they just assimilated. There's quite a bit of literary freedom in Hosea. Even in the first 3 chapters, we find third-person narrative in chapter 1, an oracle in chapter 2, and we get an autobiographical account in chapter 3. And let's talk a little bit about the term hapax legomenon, or hapax for short. This refers to a word that is only used once in a given text. So if you're reading the Bible in Hebrew and you come across a word that you don't understand, the first thing you do is look to see how that word is used elsewhere in the Bible. but there are a few words that are only used once. Then you have to go to other Semitic languages to try to decide how best to understand the meaning of that word. It turns out there are quite a few hapax in Hosea. And it's not only the hapax, but the grammatical structure is unusual. Most Bible scholars would say that next to Job, Hosea is the most difficult book to translate. Some attribute this to a northern Israelite dialect compared to Judah. That is, Hosea spoke like an Israelite, but most of what we read comes from Judah, which has a slight difference. All right, let's look at the superscription for Hosea. It starts off, the word of Yahweh that came to Hosea ben, or son of, Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam ben Joash, king of Israel. So some people think that because it lists 4 kings of Judah and just 1 of Israel, might suggest that it was edited at a later date in Judah. Let's get back to Hosea being the prophet of love. Prophets sometimes took on symbolic actions to get their point across. Hosea was trying to show that the people of Israel were being unfaithful to their God Yahweh. So he did what we'd all do. He married a prostitute named Gomer. The point was that Hosea's love for Gomer the prostitute was a microcosm for God's love to Israel. God's love for Israel was part of the covenant that God made with Moses. Yahweh would be Israel's God on the condition that Israel followed the laws in the Torah. Well, Israel didn't follow these laws. Hosea, though, really focuses on one part of the conditional covenant, that Israel be faithful to Yahweh. We have many treaties from the ancient Near East, and these are often referred to as suzerain vassal treaties, with the suzerain being the party that's in charge and the vassal being a subordinate. In these treaties, they always say the vassal must love the suzerain and the vassal must be faithful to the suzerain. So essentially, Hosea is claiming that God is finished with the covenant because God, the husband, knows that Israel, the bride, has been unfaithful. All right, Hosea's wife Gomer is called in Hebrew an Eshet Zinunim. This means literally woman of fornication, and it's a common term for a prostitute. Interestingly, some scholars have argued that Gomer might not have been a regular prostitute, but she might have been a cult prostitute. Many temples in the ancient Near East had prostitutes who would ceremoniously engage in sex in order to ensure the gods too would be fertile and thus the people would have food to eat. So there is a chance that Gomer was a prostitute in the temple of Baal, who was a Canaanite storm deity, and he was Yahweh's main rival. Here we see a small statue of Baal. He's a lot like Zeus, and his right arm's raised here either because he's going to throw a lightning bolt down from the clouds or because he's going to smite someone. He's always smiting that Baal. All right, well, marrying the prostitute Gomer is not the only symbolic act that Hosea partakes. He also gives his 3 children symbolic names. So let's look at these children's names. The first child he's going to call Jezreel. And he's going to name this kid, or God tells him to name the kid Jezreel, because this is the place in the Jezreel Valley that Jehu usurped the throne. Jehu was a king in the 9th century who took over the throne in a very violent and deadly coup. Some authors of the Bible think Jehu is one of the best kings who ever reigned because he's faithful to Yahweh, but I'm glad to see here that Hosea is criticizing him. But Hosea predicts that Jehu's descendants and the nation are going to come to an end. All right, here's what the text says. God tells him to call his name Jezreel, for in a short time I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel. All right, well, let's see where we're at with Jezreel on this map. Here we see Judah in the south, Israel in the north. We get the Dead Sea, and then we follow the Jordan River up north, we get the Sea of Galilee. And this big body of water here to the left is, of course, the Mediterranean. And let's take a look over here. So if you are traveling by land to get from Asia to Africa, or to get out of Africa to Asia or Europe, people traditionally marched along the coast, not in the sand, but in a more firm area, just a little bit inland. It's a very important road people would take. But once they got up here to the north, we get these M's represent mountains around the Carmel, Lebanon region. So you couldn't walk along the coast anymore. So people would cut inland through this route, and it's called the Jezreel Valley. One of the sites there is named Jezreel. It's a very important piece of real estate, and in addition to the site of Jezreel, it contains cities such as Megiddo. And I can't think of a place on earth where more key battles were waged throughout history. You control this valley, you control everyone going in and out of Africa. Lots of wars are fought there. All right, so that's where Jezreel's at. Let's look at his other kid. After the first son, Jezreel, they have a daughter. All right, and God tells Hosea to name her Lo Ruchama, which means no mercy. So God won't have mercy on Israel, and he's going to allow Assyria to punish it for unfaithfulness and oppressing the poor. And his third kid is a son, just like Jezreel. God tells him to name him Lo Ami, which means not my people. God rejects Israel as his people due to their sins. All right, so symbolic names of the three kids. Then it turns out that Gomer leaves Hosea. I can't blame her after the names of those kids he gave him, but God tells Hosea to rescue Gomer. So let's look at this passage. The Lord said to me, "Go, show your love to your wife again, though she is loved by another man and is an adulteress. Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and love their sacred raisin cakes." So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver, and about a homer and a lethek of barley. Then I told her, "You are to live with me many days. You must not be a prostitute or be intimate with any man, and I will behave the same way toward you. For the Israelites will live many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred stone, without ephod or household gods. Afterward the Israelites will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will come trembling to the Lord and to his blessings in the last days." All right, a couple things here. They're worshiping other gods and loving the sacred raisin cakes. We know from bread molds, well, first I should say that food is a big part of religion in the ancient world, just as it is today. And we know from bread molds and other things that often they would make cakes in the form of pubic triangles, and these played a big role in a lot of fertility cults. So perhaps Hosea is referencing some sort of bread that they used when worshiping Baal or Asherah. All right, then here's what he pays to get her back. Hapak. We have a hapax here with the term lethek, so we don't know exactly how much that is. But I would also add the Septuagint, the Greek translation, adds that he throws in some wine for this deal as well. So that sounds better. But if we look elsewhere, the price for a slave is about 30 shekels of silver. So some people guess that maybe he just had 15, that was half of what he needed. So he had to throw in some barley, perhaps some wine too. So that's what he pays to get her back. We don't know how the story ends. All right, so let's look at part 2. And Hosea is mostly poetry. For example, we see this passage, "I know Ephraim and Israel is not hid from me." The most common feature of biblical poetry, as it is with all ancient Eastern poetry, it's not that it rhymes, because it doesn't. It's what we call parallelism. That's where they say one stanza and follow it up with a similar stanza. For example, we get, "I know Ephraim," and then it's going to be followed by much the same meaning. It says, "And Israel is not hid from me." It's not hid from me is in parallel construct to know Ephraim to Israel. Ephraim was one of the tribes of Israel. Back in Genesis, Ephraim was one of Joseph's twin sons. So when they say Ephraim in this passage, they're referring to Israel. And when they say Samaria, they're referring to the capital city. All right, so what was Israel's crime? Well, it was not being faithful and worshiping other deities. There's a little bit of social justice in here, but not nearly as much as Amos. It's more about religious infidelity. The punishment is going to be destruction, the end of having a king in Israel. And when the country does fall to the Assyrians in 722, the people who brought his oracles south to Judah must have been impressed that, wow, here's this guy who predicted the end of Israel. So that's the reason he made it into the canon of the Bible. But it's not going to be all bad, because in the future, Israel's going to say they're sorry and God's going to take them back. And as you're reading Hosea, pay attention to familial metaphors. They talk a lot about husbands and wives, right? With Israel being the wife, God being the husband. Father and son, we get that a lot too here. All right, so Hosea, prophet of love. On one level, it's a story like so many horrible movies about some great faithful guy in love with a fun-loving woman who cheats on him. Oh, that's sad. On another level, it's a story about a man who gives his 3 kids some pretty awful names. I mean, who names his daughter No Mercy? I mean, she's going to be a wrestler. That might come in handy, but otherwise, it's a terrible name. But on a higher level, Hosea is doing his best to ensure that his fellow Israelites remain faithful to their covenant with God. And if you're interested, I'd recommend watching the video on Micah next. Like Amos and Hosea, he was an 8th century prophet. But unlike Amos and Hosea, Micah did not work in Israel, but instead he prophesied in Judah. The end.